Right. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Dr. Croft.
Good morning, Madam.
First of all, can I apologise for the late start? I shouldn't have had that discussion yesterday afternoon about times of starting. It's jinxed, obviously. It was, however, caused by some technical delay, and I apologise for that. But we are now ready to go, and again, I think it's Mr. Edwards.
It is. Thank you, my Lord. Good morning, Dr. Croft.
Good morning, Mr. Edwards.
Yesterday we finished theme E, and there are three remaining themes then. Theme F concerns pre-pandemic planning, and in your supplemental, for the purposes of your supplemental report, you were asked two questions, and your answers are set out there, and there are no further questions that have been posed, and I don't intend to ask you anything further on theme F. On theme G, concerned testing,
Yes.
the testing devices and the approach to testing and false positives and so on. And in your supplemental report, you were asked, three groups of questions, and you've answered them. There is a supplemental question, which I'm not going to ask any further questions in theme G. In your supplemental report, they are there, but there is a further Rule 9 question from the Scottish Vaccine Injury Group. It's the third of their questions, and it's focused on your answer to G2 in your supplemental report. I think that's coming up now on the screen. The question that you were asked in your supplemental report is, can you describe the limitations on testing in the early stages of the pandemic? What were the reasons? And your response refers to page 35 of your original report. And you explain again briefly that each of the available tests has limitations, and you say a little bit more about the tests. Now, the Rule 9 question from the Scottish Vaccine Injury Group is this. You mention in G2 that PCR tests can provide false positives. In New Zealand, extra precautions were employed to ensure false positives were ruled out. This included ruling out testing positive because of a previous infection. For example, a person could test positive for COVID weeks after infection was cleared. Serology, repeat testing, history and symptoms. And the question then is, well, first of all, do you agree with that statement?
It's a statement about what happened in New Zealand, and I have to take it as read. That's what was being done in New Zealand.
Is there anything else you would want to say about that?
I've had some thoughts running through my mind yesterday, but in New Zealand they're obviously adopting a very strict definition of what a COVID death was, and that might further downstream have led to them declaring fewer COVID deaths for quite good scientific reasons than other countries where they adopted a looser definition of what a COVID death was.
Yes, thank you. And then the specific question then is, does the detection of viral RNA mean a person is infectious?
Not necessarily, because the PCR tests are detecting viral RNA, and fragments of viral RNA may still be circulating in the blood after the person is no longer acutely infectious. So what it can be detecting is just a recent infection. With the passage of time, those fragments of RNA will degrade and they won't be detectable, and so the person will no longer appear to be positive. Yep.
Thank you. Now, there are a number of other Rule 9 questions from the Scottish Vaccine Injury Group. Three of those questions relate to vaccination, which is theme H, and I'll come to them later. There were two further questions relating to earlier themes, and I'm going to put them to you, but I'll do that at the very end because they relate to theme B, and it's just to make sure that all the questions have been put to you, so I'll come back to that later. So we move on then to the last theme in your supplemental report, which is theme H on various issues around vaccination. Now, again, I'm not going to ask you all the questions in your supplemental report, but there are a number of your answers that I think may require some elaboration. So as to be clear, the headings in in theme H are around, they begin with efficacy of the vaccines. They run through issues around trials of the vaccines. They then consider the MHRA technology, and they move on to consider the title, I think, is improvement and outcomes, which is of the vaccine programme, yes, which is towards the end. Organising it thematically, I think it may be helpful if I take those, the first and the last of those, because they are broadly similar themes, the efficacy of the vaccines and how efficient they are in terms of improving outcomes. So if, to get into it, if I could ask you to look first of all at H1 in your supplemental report, which is the question and answer that you give to a question from Scottish Care. And you see there that the question essentially concerns the declining efficacy of vaccines. In your earlier, in your original report, yes, you noted that the mRNA booster reaches over 90% in the 2 weeks after vaccination, and then declines towards a stable plateau of around 60% by 6 months. And then it sets out what your oral evidence was in July 2023, and you say that that should have been expected, but I don't think that this was conveyed to the general public as a likely outcome. And they then ask you 3 questions. Yep. When the relevant experts became aware of this decline, and you answer that that it was in around September 2021. And then they ask you, when should this have been communicated to the public? And you say that it should have been earlier than it was. And then they ask you, are you able to comment on whether such communication would have had an impact on the take-up rates of vaccine boosters? And your answer to that is in C. And you say that the whole point of vaccination is to acquire long-term protection against the target disease. And you consider that it would have led to reduced take-up of the mRNA vaccine. Can I just ask you, when you say the whole point of vaccination is to acquire long-term protection, is that not putting it at too high a level, in that some part of the protection, some part of the aim was surely to protect from serious disease, particularly for the vulnerable?
Yes, vaccines are generally administered to protect against serious and even fatal diseases, and the whole concept of vaccination is predicated on a single dose, or maybe 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 doses of the vaccine, and then protection is long-lasting. So that would have been the public's understanding of vaccination. They weren't anticipating that they would be going for some of them for spring and autumn boosters ad infinitum. And so therefore the whole concept of the booster that came in after the initial rollout of the vaccine was rather unexpected, and I think would have taken many people by surprise. And so that to then be informed that the protection wasn't actually long-lasting in the first place, I anticipate would have led to a reduced take-up of the vaccine in those groups who didn't feel that for them it was especially a disease that was going to cause severe outcomes or death.
When we come back to that issue, yes, as to who particularly benefits from the vaccine, but if we look now at H2, I'm not going to take every question, but H2 segues into another question, and H2, which is a question in your put in your supplemental report, and you answer it there from the Scottish Vaccine Injured Group. On day 2, afternoon 2, in your verbal evidence, you discussed that it's always preferable to use the same COVID-19 vaccine for the entire primary course. You mentioned that there is no evidence of how effective the vaccines would be if mixed. If I could just ask you to explain what you mean by the entire primary course.
The primary course, excuse me, for the COVID vaccines would be the first and second dose, and that would be considered the primary course. The boosters came in; they would be an add-on to the primary course. So
like a year later or something, or
yeah, yes, they would have. The boosters started to be given in September of 2020, and then became a regular spring and autumn event. So with vaccines, one normally talks about primary course. For example, with hepatitis B, it would be maybe months 0, 1, 2, and 3, and then you might have a booster at the 5-year point. And regimens vary according to country specifications and according to vaccines.
And then the question said, you mentioned there's no evidence of how effective the vaccines would be if mixed. And does that continue to be your position?
Yes. Clearly, if a vaccine is generating immunity through a certain mechanism, then that is the basis on which the vaccine has been found to be effective, and that type of immunity should be generated through the same immunological mechanism as far as possible. Now, it may be the case you could mix vaccines and achieve the same benefit, but it's not something that would have been demonstrated through pre-licensing experiments, because they're always focused on just the one product. And sometimes happens that, for example, with rabies, if you're bitten by a potentially rabid dog in India, for example, you might start off your course of rabies vaccine in India with a local product, then come back and continue it in Britain with our product. And it's just hoped that the two will marry up and work synergistically, not antagonistically. But ideally, a vaccine the single product should be used continuously, unless, as sometimes happened, in the case of COVID vaccines, people found that they were acutely sensitive to the vaccine they were given, the product they were given. It might have been Pfizer or Moderna, and then the usual response would be, well, we'll try the other mRNA vaccine, and if that wasn't acceptable, then a non-mRNA vaccine was made available in Britain, Nuvaxovid, I think it was called, a conventional vaccine from 2022 onwards. So there was a potential to give a vaccine of a different type, but which still had been shown to generate immunity to SARS-CoV-2.
I mean, some reason for the changing of the vaccines had to do with their availability, didn't it? I mean, AstraZeneca vaccine fell away at some point.
Yeah, that's right, yes, correct. Yes, it fell away in the end of 2022 when it was no longer being ordered by the UK government. Yes, correct.
If I could ask you to look at question H12.
Yes.
There's two questions from the Scottish ministers. The first of which, H12, focuses on page 62 of your original report, where you said most trials assessed vaccine efficacy over a short time and did not evaluate efficacy to the COVID variants of concern. And they cite Professor Daniel Prieto Alhambra, who, I think in his evidence to the UK COVID inquiry, considered the beneficial effects of COVID-19 vaccines based on sublet studies, as the question says, published in peer-reviewed journals. He suggests, that's Professor Prieto Alhambra suggests, that multiple studies have assessed the effectiveness of vaccines against new variants. Do you accept that the views expressed in your report on this issue do not represent the scientific consensus? So if I ask you that question first and ask you to bear in mind what you've been saying about the use of different vaccines at different times.
Thank you, yes. So page 62, that quote, most trials assessed vaccine efficacy over a short time. We're on H12, yes, and did not evaluate efficacy to the COVID variants of concern. That wasn't my own personal phrase. It was a direct quotation from the Cochrane review that I cited in respect of vaccines. And so that's that's this review here. So this review came out in December 2022. So that was the position in December 2022. And it may be that since then, this Professor Prieto Alhambra is considering later trials that weren't included and weren't considered by the Cochrane reviewers. Yeah. So that wasn't meant as a private observation. It was simply the state of the evidence in December 2022 as reported by the Cochrane reviewers of the trials. And obviously the situation has changed since then.
I mean, if I could pause there and just ask you to look at Dr. Tegnall's book,
Yes.
which you were taken to by my learned friend yesterday.
Yep.
You may remember towards the end of the discussion. In his report, sorry, in his, it's Annex 4, thanks to your, 5, sorry, Annex 5 to your report.
Yes.
And I think it's at page 135 of the report.
Yes, he doesn't say much about vaccines.
He doesn't say much about vaccines, but I just want to just put to you that when he says at page 209 of his book, by early spring 2021, almost all elderly people in Sweden had been vaccinated. We thought that things would now quieten down on the COVID-19 front, but the forecasts generated by my colleagues showed that there was still a high risk of a new spike in cases, and so it proved. And I think that refers to the Israeli experience, is that right?
Yes, possibly, but since the elderly people were being given the priority correctly in Sweden for vaccines, I would imagine he's also referring to younger groups who hadn't been vaccinated and who hadn't acquired infection naturally during the previous year because they were engaged in the principle of voluntary action, meaning personal distancing and enhanced hygiene. So by good fortune, they hadn't acquired COVID. So they were acquiring it as 2021 went on. So the principle of voluntary action in Sweden had effectively slowed the spread of the virus, and the late effects of it had not yet been seen as that year started. I think he was probably referring to those, possibly also to an element of waning efficacy of the vaccine in the main target groups as well. He doesn't quite clarify what he means by that, which is.
I mean, he goes on in that same passage, the vaccinations had not stopped the spread of COVID-19, which I think is well known and you refer to in your supplemental report.
Yes.
But he goes on, they offered highly effective protection against severe disease and death, but only weak protection against reinfection. So that's fine. But I just want to ask you specifically on that point he makes. They offered highly effective protection against severe disease and death.
Yeah.
He doesn't qualify that in any way by reference to particular groups, such as the elderly or the vulnerable.
No, he doesn't know. It is obviously he can't qualify every statement he's making ad infinitum, or his prose would become very turgid. But I'm sure he would. Well, I anticipate he would have wanted to qualify that if specifically asked.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see in a moment. But I just wanted to, so while we're here, I mean, it is your view that
Yes.
It's those vulnerable groups that are protected
Well,
to the largest extent.
Yeah, one might say everyone is protected, but they are especially protected because they're the ones who fit the criteria which vaccines are normally judged against, which is that they should protect against severe illness and fatal illnesses.
Just one point about the earlier passage at page 196 of Dr. Tegnall's book when he talks about the start of the vaccinations. I mean, as we remember, the vaccinations started in around December, January of 2021. And he says, well, in his view, the plan was to commence vaccinations between Christmas and New Year, which he considered less than ideal for a campaign of this magnitude. I mean, why might he think that?
I must have missed that point, yeah.
I mean, it's the start of the vaccination programme.
Yes.
What's wrong with starting it then when
Sure. Yes, indeed, yes. Yes, in Scotland, it started in December, in fact, didn't it? Even before Christmas. Is you perhaps thinking about Christmas and New Year being a time of, shall we say, when people aren't going to be available to turn up at vaccine clinics queuing outside? Is that what he's saying, thinking? Or is he thinking about the fact of it being a bit premature and vaccine supplies possibly not being available? It's not clear what his thought processes are at this point.
Just turning back to question H13, which was the other question from the Scottish ministers in this context, which refers to page 63 of your original report, where you say that dosage intervals were changed for logistical reasons.
Yeah.
I mean, before we specifically address that, it might have some part of that might have been to do with when the vaccination programme originally started, or when the vaccines were available, and so on.
It was mainly to do with the fact that supplies were rather limited in the early weeks, so that if the dosage interval was, say, 4 weeks, then it meant that people were receiving their first dose, and then 4 weeks later their second dose. But in the interim, other groups who were perhaps clamouring for the vaccine had to wait until the first at the most highest priority group had been fully vaccinated. So the idea was introduced that you could give the highest priority their first dose, and then a couple of weeks later use what would have been the second dose for that group as a first dose for the next group down, and then sometime later on give the second dose to the original highest priority group. That's why there was some tinkering around with the dosage intervals.
And in the question at H13, you're referring to your observation that the dosage intervals were changed for logistical reasons.
Yes.
The Scottish ministers say the decision was taken following advice from the JCVI and UK CMOs.
Yep.
They refer again to Professor Daniel Prieto Alhambra's suggestion that the vaccine rollout strategy was highly beneficial. And they ask, would you accept this decision was made to optimise the vaccination programme and protect as many as people as possible? You agree with that?
I agree with that principle, yes.
Thank you for that. Let me just go back for a moment. Yes, if I could take you then to question H. I'm moving to the last section because I think it dovetails in with this. So the last section begins at H28, which is improvement in outcome, including reduced case numbers, severe disease and mortality. So well, clearly it's got something to do with the efficacy of the vaccines. Once again, we have a number of questions from the Scottish ministers. And in H28, they refer to page 74 of your report, in which you state, it remains unclear as to whether or not COVID-19 vaccination has resulted in fewer deaths from COVID-19. So that was a statement in your original report. And the question then asks, there have been several studies and reports addressing the impact of vaccination on hospitalisation and death, including a WHO study that between December 20 and November 21, an estimated 27,656 deaths were directly averted because of the COVID-19 vaccination programme in Scotland. And the question then put in your supplemental report is, do you accept that the views expressed in your report on this issue do not represent the scientific consensus?
Well, I have to take issue with this idea that I'm somehow departing from the scientific consensus. What I was doing, again, there was simply quoting the Cochrane Review, which represented the evidence, the knowledge, the certain knowledge at the time the review was produced, which was December 2022. I wasn't giving a private opinion. So I wasn't departing from the scientific consensus. I was fully in line with the best scientific approach. And again, that particular phrase starts the question. It remains unclear as to whether or not COVID vaccination has resulted in fewer deaths from COVID-19. That's, again, an exact quote from the review by Granier and colleagues, the Cochrane Review of December 2022, where they say it's... They say there is insufficient evidence to determine whether there was a difference between the vaccine and placebo in terms of death, because the numbers of deaths were low in the trials. So there's potentially a reason as to why there is still that uncertainty. But it's just a matter of it's the way science works, that you start from a position of uncertainty. You don't start from a position of assumed certainty, which is what seems to be the subtext behind this particular question.
Mm-hmm. But your position, as you state there, is you agree that in the individuals who are at risk of very severe COVID, the vaccination is likely to prevent severe COVID disease.
Yes.
Yes. But the implication is that for those who are not at risk of very severe disease?
Sorry, would you repeat the question?
Well, the implication is that those who... what are we to understand from your answer in relation to those who are not at risk of very severe disease?
It'll doubtless, to an extent, prevent disease acquisition, because they will have the effect of the vaccine will be to generate, for the body to generate its own antibodies against an important component of the virus, and so they will be less likely to acquire disease, and so it'll have that effect, but it won't be as powerfully effective by definition as the vaccine is in the especially vulnerable groups.
Mm-hmm. In relation to H29, the question that's put for the purposes of your supplementary report is, again referring back to pages 51 and 52 of your original report, the question says, you refer to the safety of COVID vaccines. You discuss the adverse events reported to the MHRA, some of which suggest a fatal outcome.
Yes.
In his opening statement to Module 4 of the UK COVID inquiry, counsel to that inquiry stated that the expert evidence commissioned by that inquiry suggests overwhelmingly that the United Kingdom operated a robust and sophisticated system for ensuring the highest levels of safety. Do you agree that in general the COVID-19 vaccines are acceptably safe? That is, the benefits outweigh the risks. Now, before I ask you to comment further on your answer, can I just put a couple of points in that question specifically to you? I mean, do you agree that the United Kingdom operated a robust, and for that matter Scotland, operated a robust and sophisticated system for ensuring the highest levels of safety?
Well, the system was the system that was previously in place, which was the yellow card system, and that had been introduced in the 1960s or early 70s in response to the thalidomide disaster, which was a terrible time when women in the early stages of pregnancy were given a new antidepressant drug called thalidomide. It was actually prescribed across for all groups, but in the early stages of pregnancy, this drug had mutagenic effects on the and teratogenic effects on the fetus, and babies were born with grotesque deformities. And it was only really due to the assiduity and diligence of an Australian paediatrician who was seeing some of these very rare deformities for the first time in his life. He'd read about them in textbooks, and he was seeing 3 or 4 of them, or 5 in a short space. And he personally pinned it down to this new drug that had come in and had been prescribed in Australia and England. So at that time, there wasn't really any surveillance system, such as is implied here, for new drugs. And it was as a result of that the surveillance system was adopted in Britain, by which practitioners was prescribing drugs or vaccines would notify the regulatory authority about any unusual events, either minor or major, or fatal events that they personally, just through their clinical experience or their gut feeling or through the basis of reading, felt were associated with the drug. So that was the yellow card system, and originally there were. If I can just, this is the prescribing. I refer to it many times in my report. This is the prescribing manual that UK doctors use and practice nurses, and it comes out every 6 months. It lists all the drugs that are approved, and at the very back there were always these. There used to be one yellow card that you could tear it out. You're supposed to tear it out if your patient had come back and said, you gave me this drug and it caused this bad effect. An example would be your urine turning blue or your hair falling out or something odd and striking. And there are drugs that do exactly that. So the practitioner was meant to fill out the card and send it off free post to some address. But there was only one card. So the idea was that in 6 months you might fill out one card, which is clearly wishful thinking. And I filled out a few cards when I was prescribing. So that's the system, the robust and sophisticated system. These cards would be sent to the MHRA, the licensing authority, and the MHRA really was only resourced to count numbers under certain groups, certain organ systems, and that was about it. They couldn't do sophisticated analysis, but if they'd no doubt used algorithms and still do to work out if there was a more than expected frequency of adverse events for a particular drug, especially a new drug. And when that situation would arise, they'd alert the manufacturer and ask the manufacturer to look into it and do something about it, which might mean product recall, or it could have been just a particular batch that had become contaminated. So one can see that there are limitations to the system. It's better than nothing, but it's kind of relies on, first of all, doctors filling out these cards, which is laborious and time-consuming, and it relies on patients making the link doctors making the link with the drug or vaccine being prescribed. So inevitably, there was a lot of underreporting, always has been underreporting of adverse effects, but there's probably enough reporting. What we see is the tip of the iceberg, and in many cases that's enough to generate alarms about the safety of or otherwise of a particular product.
One wouldn't expect every adverse effect to be reported. I mean, one might have a sore arm for a day, for example. Some people might report that, but some wouldn't.
Exactly.
There must be a threshold.
Exactly, and it's so individual, it's so subjective that it's difficult to quantify that. But that was the general received advice, that there would be underreporting. When COVID vaccines came along, there was such a wealth of reporting, there was so much reporting going on, that they started to put 2 cards. And so you suddenly get 2 cards in there, and then the system became electronic. In fact, I think it had just become electronic anyway, so you could report electronically if you were a GP. And reporting was also opened up to members of the public who could report adverse reactions of their own or in people they were caring for. And so there was a wealth of, an enormous amount of reporting going on. And much of that might have been, well, much of it's likely to have been due to media concern about the safety of the novel COVID vaccines, but much of it equally would have been, due to genuine safety matters arising. Mm-hmm. And furthermore, the actual nature of the report form was changed. It was MHRA said they were going to change it to make it somehow more detailed in order to cope with this particular concern. I'm not sure exactly how it was changed, but I do know it was changed. Mm. And now the BNF doesn't have the yellow card anymore. Everything is done electronically, which probably is helpful for GPs. Possibly, I don't know. Some people prefer to fill out a card than to sit on the computer even longer than their allocated appointment time and fill out a reporting form. Yeah.
But I mean, I need to ask you just specifically about that comment, that
yes.
The comment was operated a robust and sophisticated system for ensuring the highest levels of safety.
Yes.
So, I mean, I'm not quite sure whether you're agreeing with that. I mean, are you saying it is what it is?
I'm saying it is what it is. It's a system. It's better than nothing. It's better than nothing.
Right.
It's better than what was there before thalidomide, which was nothing really. There was just a general expectation that if doctors were particularly concerned about a new drug, they would phone the Committee on Safety of Medicines directly or phone MHRA directly.
I mean, in what ways could it be better?
Well, just thinking, there could be a financial inducement to GPs to report, which was a system that applied to the notifying of infectious diseases. There was a small financial inducement for sending a report, but that's actually been taken away nowadays. You have to report.
Yeah, all right. Well,
it's interesting. I've never been asked that question before, so I dare say other countries have systems that are a little bit more advanced technologically. So it could be that possibly GP computer systems could be configured such that if a patient was reconsulting about a particular remedy they'd been prescribed in the previous consultation, a box could flash up and say, do you want to send an automatic notification that this could be an adverse reaction, like a prompt to GPs? That's perhaps one obvious way. Perhaps that already exists in some practice computer systems. It may well do.
Right. Well, thank you. But if returning to the question,
yes,
the next part of it was, do you agree that in general the COVID-19 vaccines are acceptably safe, i.e. the benefits outweigh the risks? Now, before you answer that,
yes,
the term acceptably safe, I mean, is that a term of art?
Is it a term of what?
Well, is it a term of medical science, acceptably safe? What are we to understand?
Well,
let me ask the question.
Yes.
What are we to understand by acceptably safe?
Yes.
And is it correct to define it as the benefits outweigh the risks?
Well, I think what's meant there is that at a population level, when one's administering a vaccine at a population level, there will always be some individuals who react idiosyncratically, so through some unexpected reaction to the vaccine, and they may react severely, and there are vaccine-associated deaths. There always have been vaccine-associated adverse events, and furthermore, there are times when, as I've just alluded to, vaccine batches can become contaminated. Often with sometimes with new vaccines, there are severe adverse events, very severe, that hadn't been anticipated through trials, because trials can only be done on fairly limited populations. So when the vaccine is rolled out to millions, these rare adverse events will become apparent. But in general, the approach is that at a population level, these individual mishaps or even tragedies are to be tolerated and to be accepted, because the benefit of the population as a whole outweighs those individual adverse events, those individual problems. There was a vaccine again that was developed for rotavirus mainly for African children. Rotavirus is a disease that causes diarrheal illness and leads to death in millions of African children. And this was found, after it had been approved and rolled out, to cause a condition called intussusception, which is where the intestine just folds into itself and the baby just dies of intestinal blockage. So it was causing quite a number of deaths. I think it might have been dozens or hundreds even, maybe. And at that point, the vaccine was withdrawn completely, because it was felt that it wasn't acceptable to have that as an outcome for a disease that could be treated through fluids and careful basic care.
I mean, for present purposes, are you happy to accept the definition of acceptably safe as the benefits outweigh the risks?
Yes, I didn't. In my response, I didn't answer that. I was thinking about that, and it really depends on the group and the group who are receiving the vaccine. And if the group is one where the condition really is very high risk, then yes, that population level argument I think does hold. Okay. Of course.
And if I may say so, but it's for you to answer, that suggestion feeds into your answer, which
yes.
is when administered to those individuals who are at risk of very severe COVID-19,
right, yes. Yep.
meaning the very old and those with conditions that are
yes.
very severely immunocompromising,
yes.
you agree that the benefits of COVID-19 vaccination outweigh the risks?
Yes.
Yes. But there's an implication
yes.
there left hanging,
yes.
which is that for those who don't fall within that cohort,
yes.
or those cohorts,
yes.
your view is that the benefits do not outweigh the risks?
Not necessarily, no. It would be an individual decision, and on basis of what we talked about yesterday, the principle of voluntary action, because there would be some recipients of the vaccine who really were at very low risk of severe illness or death, I'm talking about the younger age groups, the children who are healthy, the risk, and we were discussing yesterday, I think Ms. Gale read out the quote from Dr. Ioannidis in his paper that the risk of severe illness or death from COVID-19 in children is effectively zero, very close to zero. So that would be a situation where potentially the anticipated benefit from the vaccine wouldn't be that great, whereas there would be, if there was a significant risk of a severe adverse event or death, then the balance of risk and benefit is tilted in favour, is tilted against the vaccine for those particular groups.
So there's just two follow-on questions. I mean, the first is, you use the words voluntary to some extent in the balance of risk.
Yes.
Some parts got to be given to voluntary decision-making.
Yes. Well, in our society, vaccine uptake is notionally voluntary. In some sectors, in some countries, it's compulsory. For example, in the United States, it's compulsory if you're attending a public school. If you want to send your children to a public school, by which they mean a state school, they have to have the full vaccination program. So it's like it's a coercive system in effect, and it's done with population benefit in mind. And equally, I think that applies also to colleges, because there are some vaccines that are given during adolescence. If you want to attend a federal-funded college, you have to have vaccination against meningitis.
Well, you can't get your child into a state school in the United States unless you show the vaccine certificate.
Yes, exactly.
From my personal experience, you are correct.
But in Britain, vaccinations notionally are voluntary, although in practice there are employers who may insist on vaccination proof being supplied, and this did happen during COVID, and teachers were expected to get vaccinated, for example.
Yes. The inquiry has heard some evidence from those who suffer from long COVID, and in particular,
yes,
children who suffer from long COVID. I mean, when considering the benefits outweighing the risks, I mean, would you want to expand on the vulnerable cohort in terms of the benefits of the vaccine? That is that those
yes,
even the young who suffer who suffer or might suffer from long COVID could be treated as falling
yes,
within
yes,
those at risk of severe COVID.
Yes. Well, long COVID is one of those areas where there's still so much uncertainty that I hesitate to sound as I'm an authority on long COVID. But I suppose logically, if you were going to be vaccinated, you'd be less likely to acquire severe COVID for a time, given that vaccination wanes. And so therefore, logically, there would be less long COVID around if everyone was being vaccinated. But there still is the risk, because the vaccine effect will wane over time. But yes, that's one of the arguments that has been used in favour of mass vaccination of all groups.
If we turned to question H32,
yes,
this is a question from, it's in the same section, and it's from the Scottish Vaccine Injured Group. So there are two questions I just want to raise with you. H32. So they refer back to page 71 of your original report. In early 2023, the MHRA announced that it would no longer be issuing special publications on the spontaneously reported adverse effects associated with COVID-19 vaccines. The reasons for this announcement, they say, are unclear. Around the same time, and for reasons that are also unclear in their view, the December 2022 report was removed from the agency's website. And they ask you, what was the last date that HMRA published reports of adverse events for COVID-19 vaccines, and what are those numbers? Now, you answer that in paragraph A, in your answer to A,
yes,
and you refer again to the long-standing yellow card scheme. What is the expected rate of reporting of adverse events to yellow card? And you answer that in B. I'm not going to ask you any more about that. But then you say, has the December 22 report since been reinstated on MHRA's website? And you say no. I mean, as far as you know, does that continue to be the
I think that is good. I had a look at the website this morning after breakfast. As a matter of fact, I couldn't find it there, but I might have not been looking assiduously. But this is the report. This was the report they brought out. Part of the arrangement under which the MHRA. I printed out a copy before it was removed from the website, so this is a hard copy. Part of the arrangement under which the novel vaccines were authorised for supply. They weren't licensed for some time. They may now be licensed, but they were authorised under a conditional agreement, was that the MHRA would monitor them very closely for 2 years and then would produce a report. So this is the report that was produced in December 2022, my Lord. And it's really, again, as I said, the MHRA really, they count numbers, and they've grouped the numbers under various categories instead of some pie charts, but they don't really attempt tables of numbers, and quite interesting, male and female and so on, for the vaccines that were available then, which was Moderna, AstraZeneca and Pfizer. But they don't go in for a very detailed a detailed analysis as to what might be going on. It's simply a reporting exercise without a lot of interpretation, because they're not funded to carry out intensive pharmacological type of inquiry. They're simply presenting the data. Then after that, they simply, the vaccines just form part of their routine reporting of any other drug that people might report about.
Thank you, Dr. Croft. If we could go back briefly then to some earlier questions on trials, and this is the last set of questions that I have for you under vaccination, arising from your supplemental report. Yeah. There's a series of questions posed to you from H14 onwards, yes. About trials, and putting it in my own words, there is, I think, a sub-theme in these questions that, which your answers touch on, that the testing of the vaccine, the trials of the vaccine and the rollout of the vaccine were a little rushed. Putting it in my own words. I mean, do you have any view about that?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. So in my original report to the inquiry, I took each vaccine in turn, and I, on the basis of the pivotal study that had been put forward to the MHRA for conditional approval, which isn't the same as licensing, each manufacturer was obliged to put forward a randomized control trial. I assessed the strengths and the weaknesses of the evidence on the basis of those trials. So for some of them, they seemed to, they had different strengths and weaknesses. But so, for example, let's take, for example, the AstraZeneca trial. Here we are. So I said, so these were my comments, because I felt I had to comment sometimes, giving my own opinion, whereas I tried to generally, and I continue to try and give what is the best scientific position insofar as one exists. So for the AstraZeneca study, I said comments. All of these vaccines had to produce a randomized controlled trial, because, as I said yesterday, I apologise for repeating myself, that is the only evidence that can give on which clinical decision making can and should be based. So that was an absolute precondition of any sort of temporary approval of the product. So the AstraZeneca study that was published in The Lancet in August 2020, and then another follow-up study in The Lancet in December 2021, and then the vaccine was rolled out, but didn't last very long because it was withdrawn at the end of 2022, early 2023. But so what can we say about this study? Limitations are a rather small number of participants, and as we were only 543 actually receiving the vaccine. So if one was thinking about a major thromboembolic event, a clot, stroke, that was fairly rare, like occurring in 1 in 1,000 people, that would not have been picked up by this rather small study, and the patients weren't, the vaccine recipients weren't followed up very long. They were only followed up for 4 weeks, and also they weren't using a proper placebo. They were using a different vaccine. They're using a vaccine as a control group. So that's not really what you should do in vaccine trials. I understand you should have placebo, so that you're genuinely seeing what are the genuine side effects that relate to your product, and you're not comparing with a product that will also have side effects. So then, because it also has side effects, it'll minimise the impact of your own side. So there was some obvious weaknesses, and inevitable weaknesses, in the evidence that was put forward for the conditional approval of the vaccine, and they were apparent to me, and they were apparent then. But because of the potential population benefit that would result from this vaccine, it was a British vaccine after all, and the population benefit that would accrue, it was authorised for use for 2 years, and then was no longer authorised. So that was the position then.
I mean, perhaps finally, all these points that you've been making are focused, at least to some extent, in the question from the Scottish Vaccine Injured Group at age 22.
Yes.
So remember, this is focusing on trials, not
Yes.
post-administration.
Yes.
For many of the currently available COVID-19 vaccines, serious adverse events, which are exemplified, appear to be few based on the reported RCTs. However, this apparently low number, in their view, may be due to the very short follow-up period in many of the reported vaccine RCTs, the fact that the candidate vaccine was not compared against a true placebo, the number of participants in the reported RCTs was small, the RCT participants were optimally healthy at time of vaccination, or were otherwise unrepresentative of the majority of the UK population, or a combination in any or all of the foregoing. Well, I mean, I think that summarises to some extent what you've been saying.
Well, yes, that's right, yes. And indeed, it's partly because of those obvious limitations that the MHRA were conducting this study in the background, and they were just topping up with numbers. So they were conducting a sort of beauty contest, which are the safest of these vaccines, and regrettably, AstraZeneca seemed to come out bottom of the tables. There was another vaccine produced by Johnson & Johnson that had been pre-ordered, if you remember my novel. They never actually come. No, it seems no stocks ever actually arrived, and then it just sort of quietly disappeared. So in a crude way, there was a sort of monitoring of the vaccines, and then there was some adjustment as to what was authorised. And then I think the position now is that the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine have been properly licensed. So they're licensed for use.
When you say properly licensed, are you suggesting they weren't properly licensed before?
Yes, of course. What happened during this period? They were. And I put it in my report. They were. Here we are. There was approval to supply, which is not quite the same thing as licensing. There are legal implications to giving a product license. So there's approval to supply the products, and while in the early stages they were being closely monitored, rather more closely than is usually the case by the MHRA, who had either voluntarily or had been instructed to carry out a 2-year surveillance of the reported adverse events, which was much more than they anticipated would occur. And this was the outcome of what they found after 2 years.
They then ask you when AstraZeneca's report was published in November 23 of the clinical trial results, what percentage of participants reported a serious adverse event? Now, you give your answer to that. But I just want to ask you, in relation to B, did Pfizer, AstraZeneca or Moderna clinical trials include people with comorbidities? Comorbidities such as rheumatoid arthritis, polymyalgia rheumatica, or other autoimmune conditions. Now, you give perhaps a succinct no to that question, but I mean, I would want to ask you: would one have expected such trialling to have been done on people with comorbidities?
Well, actually, no, that's a good point. They didn't include people with comorbidities, and with hindsight, that's a limitation of the trials, because people with I'll retract. People with comorbidities are more likely to experience severe disease, but they won't necessarily experience more severe adverse events from the vaccine. So in trials, it's normal to use populations of vaccine trials and also drug trials, really, populations of volunteers who are optimally healthy, because if they're sick for some other reason, so if, let's say they've got rheumatoid arthritis, they will have symptoms associated with that condition, and they'll have symptoms associated with the drugs they're taking for that condition. So that'll muddy the waters to some extent. So it makes it more difficult to work out whether the experience they report while taking the new product, the candidate product, whether it be a vaccine or a drug, is related to the new product, or whether it's just some baggage from their pre-existing illness and treatment experience. So it is normal to have people who are pretty healthy and don't have significant problems with other illnesses. In particular, they have to have good liver function, because most drugs are excreted through the liver, and good kidney function. Some drugs are excreted through the kidneys.
Is there any reason why the question focuses on autoimmune conditions?
I'm not sure.
Because the ones you've identified are with kidneys and liver unlikely to be autoimmune conditions. It's not your question.
No, interesting. Thank you, my lord. I presume people with autoimmune conditions they're likely to have a suboptimally functioning immune system, and so therefore they would respond in a different way potentially to a vaccine than people who didn't have those autoimmune conditions.
Yes, but people with other comorbidities that are not autoimmune conditions would likewise
yes, indeed,
repressed or depressed immune systems.
Yes,
it would be vulnerable.
Yeah, it would make the trial very complex to be considering different dimensions of safety. But this is sort of clearly there's a good point behind here, and this is where you might conduct an observational study. Looking at people with autoimmune conditions, seeing if did they especially have bad experiences with the vaccine, and if they did, then you might go on to you generate a hypothesis, which you would then test with a randomized controlled trial, where you're just giving the vaccine to people with autoimmune conditions in a randomized way. So this is clearly a question that has some relevance, but it's not a particular question that the vaccine trials set out to answer. What they set out to address is the vaccine efficacious and reasonably safe in the general population? That was the question that those trials purported to address.
Thank you, Dr. Croft. Those are the matters in Theme H that I wanted to highlight. Of course, because I haven't asked all of the questions, doesn't matter, because your report is in the inquiries record, as are your answers in the supplemental report. What that leaves is the Rule 9 questions that I mentioned earlier, and all of these remaining questions were also posed by the Scottish Vaccine Injury Group. So there are 3 questions in relation to Theme H vaccination, and one of them is quite a long question. There's a preambular statement which I will read, and then I'll ask you if you agree with it. So question 5, posed as a Rule 9 question by the Scottish Vaccine Injury Group, was this. You previously stated that COVID-19 vaccines are effective, or probably effective, in reducing the incidence of COVID-19 and severe COVID-19. So I interpolate, that's consistent with what you've said just now.
Yes, with the caveat that I was simply quoting the best authority, yes.
Very good. Continuing. The Cochrane Review of COVID-19 vaccines states that it is unclear as to whether or not vaccination has made any difference to the numbers of deaths from COVID-19. They quote from the Cochrane Review that there is insufficient evidence to determine whether there was a difference between the vaccine and placebo in terms of death, because the numbers of deaths were low in the trials, and updated this that's been updated in the response to question H4 in your supplemental report, to say that the situation hasn't yet altered because there have been no more updates in the Cochrane Library since then. Now, they go on. Do you agree with that? Sorry.
Yes, I think what's meant is that there hasn't been an updated version of this Cochrane Review, which is called Efficacy and Safety of COVID Vaccines, published in December 2022. And I take that to mean that there probably is more evidence, but it wouldn't materially alter it wouldn't substantively alter the author's conclusions, so they haven't brought out an emergency update.
No.
They still stand by their conclusions, yes.
But we also have your answer to the questions posed by the Scottish ministers earlier. So what the question says is, to continue along this theme, vaccines were heralded in Scotland as being our way out of lockdown. And then to paraphrase, public messaging repeatedly said the vaccines were safe and effective and quoted the absolute risk reduction as opposed to the relative risk reduction. I'm quoting directly from the question. Can you explain for us the difference between the two and why there are regulations in place to ensure the public is given the relative risk reduction? I've got to put that question in a slightly different way to you. First of all, the question turns on a difference between the absolute risk reduction as opposed to the relative risk reduction. So could you explain the difference between those two for the inquiry?
Yes, these are terms that are used by statisticians when describing in numerical terms the effect, either beneficial or adverse, of a drug or a vaccine. So to give an example, my lord, let's leave aside COVID vaccines. So if we consider a vaccine against diphtheria, which is a childhood illness that used to be very prevalent, there used to be 60,000 cases in England and Wales notified every year, and about 4,000 deaths, and I'm interested in diphtheria because my own uncle on my mother's side died of it at age 5. So it was a vaccine preventable disease, but only once a vaccine had become introduced. He died in 1935, so long before I even knew him. But so it was very serious and life-threatening illness. 1940, and it's caused by a bacterium called Corynebacterium diphtheria, which produces a toxin which circulates in the system and can cause damage to to many of the body systems and can result in death. It's mainly respiratory, but so in 1942 a vaccine came out. So if we consider that the risk before the vaccine came out, if the risk of dying from diphtheria was, let's say it was 10%, because many people acquired diphtheria but didn't die, but let's say 10% died, so that would be the baseline risk. When the vaccine came out, and it was a modified toxin. It was called a toxoid. So we were given the toxin, but in a less virulent form. So it carried some risks. So let's say when the vaccine came out, I don't know the exact figures. Let's say the risk came down from 10% of dying to 5% of dying. So that is the ARR, the absolute risk reduction. So you've got and it's described in percentage points. So the manufacturers of this new vaccine would have gone to the Department of Health and said, this vaccine causes an absolute risk reduction of 5 percentage points. And that's in bald terms, it's just the raw figures, the difference between the two risks. And there's another way of looking at the same data, and that's saying, well, what's the relative reduction? To what extent have you achieved a reduction in risk? And you do the calculations, and in that case, you've achieved a 50% relative risk reduction. So you've gone from 10% to 5%. So that sounds pretty good, very good. So they say, okay, so there's still quite a high risk. So because there's still quite a high, because the 10% risk is a high baseline. Let's go for this vaccine. It doesn't completely wipe out the risk, but it reduces it by 50%. The problem arises. So often that's how often vaccine manufacturers and drug manufacturers will report the relative risk only, because that often gives a very good impression. It's probably easier for people to understand the relative risk, but the problem is that when you have a risk and a baseline risk that's very low, so let's say with diphtheria the risk of dying was only 1%. Yeah. But that risk was reduced to 0.5%. Mm-hmm. So you've still got the same relative reduction, okay. But the absolute risk reduction is only 0.5%. Mm-hmm. And with the vaccine, you've got a significant number of potential adverse events. So therefore, that makes makes the picture look rather different. So if a manufacturer came and said, well, we've got a vaccine for diphtheria, it's causing 1%, the relative risk reduction is 50%. You'd want to say, well, what's the absolute risk reduction there? Because that puts the 50% in context. So in reality, for new products, you need really to have both sets of information. It's quite hard to keep both in mind at the same time. And I suspect there's a sound point being made there, which is it is a common criticism of the salesman that they will just quote the relative risk reduction for a problem that's really actually very minor. So therefore, the relative reduction seems to inflate or seems to exaggerate the benefit, and the personal benefit and the population benefit of the new product.
So if I can put it in the context of the question, I anticipate that the point has been put the other way round, because what the question said was, in the view of the Scottish Vaccine Injured Group, public messaging repeatedly said the vaccines were safe and effective and quoted the absolute risk reduction as opposed to the relative risk reduction. I mean, on the basis of what you've just said, if only the relative risk reduction was advanced, that would be more encouraging.
Well, in fact, you need both. So maybe, I don't know what the messaging actually said, but you can't really have one without the other. You've got to have both, really, to sort of weigh them up in context.
So best practice, in your view, would be that any public messaging would present both the absolute risk and the relative risk?
Well, yes. I mean, you see, the key point here, I think, misread, was that the risks varied, the absolute risks and the relative risks were different according to the age group you were in. You see, so if you're in, say, the over 85s, many of them acquired COVID and survived, but probably they equated to a risk of death of 10% in the absence, and then which was reduced to 5%. So therefore, the figure I gave for diphtheria would have applied to them. There would have been an absolute risk reduction from the vaccine of 5 percentage points and a relative risk reduction of 50%. So that would be all. But for, let's say, healthy children, the risk might have been 1% or 0.1% of dying from COVID. So therefore, for the manufacturer to say, oh, we've got a relative risk reduction here of 50% would be somewhat disingenuous, because the baseline risk was so low anyway that they were the policymakers would be asked to sign up to a new type of vaccine of which the effects were not fully known. So really, in an ideal world, we would have where the new product, a vaccine or drug, has different benefits and harms based on age stratification. We would ideally like the full data, the absolute risk reduction and the relative risk reduction for each of the different age bands. That would be ideal. It would make life quite complicated, but it would ensure full transparency.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've said you don't remember what the public messaging was around and whether it referred to any relative or absolute risk reduction.
Scotland, well, most of the I'm interested in this idea that the public were being told about risks in numerical terms anyway, because from what I recall in Britain, we were just told it was, in England, it was just told it was effective. But for professionals, the messaging comes through this thing called the Green Book. This is the Green Book, Immunisation Against Infectious Diseases. It was produced over a few years by the Department of Health, and all the diseases that can be prevented by vaccines are listed alphabetically in this Green Book, starting with anthrax, I think it's anthrax, ending with, it's varicella zoster, chickenpox. Nowadays it's produced online, and there are some numbers in there, and it doesn't generally say what the numbers that quote studies. So the numbers talk about percentage efficacy of vaccines, but generally, as far as I can see in the Green Book, what they're referring to is relative risk reductions only. They don't break them down into absolute risk reductions, because this is addressed mainly to GPs, general practitioners and practice nurses, and they might have difficulty with these numbers, as indeed I have some difficulty. So they have to use figures that can be easily grasped. And I mean, I agree that ideally one should present all of the data and expect people to understand the complexity of the data, but one has to accept that people's understanding of mathematics is limited by personal reasons and so on. So it's not it's something that it's a practice that's, I think, hasn't been, it's not as though the practice has been changed to obfuscate the knowledge around the efficacy and safety of COVID vaccines. It's just that it's the same type of reporting that's historically been used in the Green Book and spin-offs from the Green Book, which might be public messages, that they would derive their information from that sort of central knowledge base. And without realising it, may be that they're using relative risks in a manner which could be strictly construed as being somewhat misleading and somewhat favouring the beneficial impact of the new product. In this case, we're talking about COVID vaccines.
Yes. If you remember, the question was, it included a question about, can you explain why there are regulations in place to ensure the public is given the relative risk reduction? I mean, are you aware of any such regulations?
I'm not aware of any such regulations. No, if it would be practitioners, I would imagine, who would be given this quite complex information, but I haven't seen it spelt out in such an explicit way. In the Green Book, as I've just said, there are many percentages cited about various vaccine efficacies, and having given it thought, I now take it that generally what's being referred to as a relative risk for the different vaccines, and for most vaccines it's not contentious. You accept a 80% relative risk reduction or 50% is just gives a good indication as to how beneficial the vaccine is. But when within the target population there are these quite important differences in baseline risk, which for COVID-19 there are, then it becomes very important as to whether one's as to quite what information is being conveyed centrally about the effect of the product.
Question 6 from the Scottish COVID injured group refers to H32, which we looked at earlier. Yes. In your supplemental report. And it's more of a statement than a question, but I've got to put it to you so you can comment on it. Yes. At H32, you kindly gave us updated numbers of yellow card reports. Yes. I wonder if you inadvertently gave us the reports for AstraZeneca, which now sits at 250,411 total number of reports. And let me pause there and ask you to answer that.
Yes, 602. Yes, if we could scroll down a little bit down there. Yeah. Yep. Yes, I included that screenshot there, and yes, that's quite great. I apologise to the inquiry. I had the screenshot that I'd taken from the MHRA website, and I cut off the top by mistake. And just above there, it should say these are the outline figures just for AstraZeneca, and that's what I think the vaccine injured group is saying. So I then went back to the website and I found the equivalent screenshots for the Pfizer product and the Moderna product, and they're comparable. So in fact, I've got them here. There are some limitations to these figures, which I must mention in a moment. And these figures, obviously, every day they change. They're always going up and never coming down, because people are reporting all the time. So. Yes, so I read the AstraZeneca inquiry a few days ago, and it was now 250,473 reports. So people are obviously still reporting about AstraZeneca adverse events, even though it hasn't been prescribed, hasn't been administered for a couple of years now. So there's a time delay in the recognition or the apparent recognition of adverse events. The number of adverse reactions in total is 889,811, so it's gone up. The bottom left-hand box is now 194,279 serious adverse drug reactions, suspected serious adverse, and then the total number of reports with a reported fatal outcome following AstraZeneca vaccine is now 1,526. So they're very large numbers, and I'll come on in a moment to to the equivalent numbers with the conventional vaccine, Nuvaxovid, which I checked this morning, and I can tell you now that fatal outcomes are 0 with that.
Yes.
So, but
and that's a specific question you're asked without going into the numbers, as to whether, in effect, as to whether or not the reporting of suspected adverse reactions is comparable. That's essentially the...
It's more or less comparable amongst the 3 mRNA vaccines. So if we recall, J-COVID and the Johnson & Johnson product dropped out quite early on. The next one to fall off the cliff was AstraZeneca. So we're now left with Pfizer and Moderna. So just looking at I won't go through all the numbers, but the Pfizer reported deaths are 937. And then the total reactions reported are 519,000. And Moderna, the total reported deaths are 108. And then the total number of adverse reactions, 143,617. Of course, every day those figures go up a little bit. So that's the position when I took the screenshot. So we're talking about adverse events, reported adverse reactions in the hundreds of thousands, and we're talking about reported fatal outcomes in the hundreds, or in the case of AstraZeneca in the early. Just over 1,000 for these novel gene technology vaccines. So at the same time as these have been given, there has been this other product, which is a conventional vaccine, Nuvaxovid. So I just thought I'd look up to see what the reports was for them, and did that this morning. Novavax, which is produced by a company called Nuvaxovid, and the total adverse reports is 527. So that compares to what we see there. And of those, 125 were judged to be serious by those reporting them, and there haven't been any fatal events reported. Now, the problem is, my thought, that these are what they call the numerators, but we don't know what the denominators are. We don't know how many Nuvaxovid vaccines have been given in total, so it may be that only 600 were given, and of those, 527 resulted in an adverse reaction. Mm-hmm. So this is part of the problem with the system we have, that the actual number of doses is not recorded by MHRA because it's meant to be commercially confidential. So all we're getting is sort of the noise, the numbers, and we can infer something from the noise. And what I infer from this is that Nuvaxovid doesn't seem to result in any fatalities that people are concerned about, even though one would have thought there would be a few people who have the vaccine and just by chance die the next day or the day after, and the GP might think, oh, well, maybe that was due to this COVID vaccine, but it doesn't seem to be the case.
I mean, just for the record, the Scottish Vaccine Injury Group, they say that on their figures, the total number of suspected adverse reactions is at 1,618,236,
yes,
reported by nearly 500,000 individuals.
Right.
370,405, I think, of the suspected adverse reactions were reported as serious, and there were 2,931 deaths reported.
That's right, yes. So I'm sure what they've done is they've added up each box for the three headline vaccines. Mm. Yep.
But those figures broadly align with what you're reporting.
Yes. And of course today the numbers will be different. But yeah.
Thank you. Question 7 from the Scottish Vaccine Injury Group was, could the Scottish Government have communicated side effects, adverse reactions to the public earlier than they did, based on the knowledge they had available at that time?
Well, again, this is a question about what the Scottish Government were doing, and how were they communicating these adverse effects?
One seems to remember that there was communication from regularly about adverse effects.
Okay. Oh, well, then that's how, when people presented for vaccination, they would be given a list or asked to perhaps look at a list online. So there would be a list of vaccines. Well, yes. So in any communication about safety or efficacy, the sooner the communication is given, the better. That stands to reason. So the answer to the question must be ideally yes. Information, good or bad, should be communicated as rapidly as possible because it has important implications for the recipient's health, both good and bad.
Thank you. My Lord, if I may just finish the questions from the Scottish Vaccine Injury Group. There are two questions relating to other themes in the report, and for the sake of completeness, if I could just ask Dr. Croft about those. There are two questions, which I think both relate to theme B. So, the Scottish Vaccine Injury Group's first question was this. In B1, if that might be brought up on screen, in question B1, you discuss aerosol spread of COVID-19 in addition to droplet spread. If you remember, this was discussed with my learned friend yesterday.
Yes.
In July 2020, the World Health Organization updated their website to state that short-range aerosol transmission, quoting, short-range aerosol transmission, particularly in specific indoor locations, such as crowded and inadequately ventilated spaces, over a prolonged period of time with infected persons cannot be ruled out, unquote. And then this changed by April 2021 to saying that aerosols remain suspended in the air or travel farther than 2 metres, brackets long range. Is there any evidence that you're aware of concerning how FAR aerosols can spread? So that's the first question.
So how far they can spread?
Yes.
Yes. Aerosols and aerodynamics of fluids suspended in the air is a science in itself, and I'm not an aerosol expert, but from the practical implication of what aerosols can mean in terms of public health, there are diseases where the acquisition can occur through infected aerosols, and there's a condition called Q fever, which is again a multi-system illness where the organism, which is called Coxiella burnetii, it's like a bacteria, but not exactly. It is shed by infected animals, especially sheep, goat, and cows, in the products of parturition, so in the placenta and blood and amniotic fluid of sheep, goats, and cows that are giving birth. So it's especially prevalent in the spring. And if those spores, they can affect humans who are handling the sheep, goats, and cows, sheep shearers, and so on. And if the spores become aerosolized, so that maybe it's rainy and windy at the same time, they can enter a cloud of vapor which contains these spores and can drift some miles away from the farm or the abattoir, wherever the animals are to be found, and can affect people in quite a wide area. So, but these spores are, by their nature, they're quite resistant to desiccation, to drying. So ideal conditions have to apply. But there have been cases of several thousand. In the Netherlands, there was an outbreak of 4,000 people who acquired Q fever who were downwind from a farm where there were a lot of lambing going on, and the sheep and the cattle and the goats were infected, but not obviously infected, and humans then became incidentally infected. So there's an example of an aerosol that can drift some kilometres containing these infected particles. Another example, just one more example, is Legionnaire's disease, which is again a bacterial disease where Legionella colonize standing water in artificial water systems, and if the water's not done, it's a matter of much litigation. And if the standing water, the water tanks are not properly sterilised periodically, the bacteria will breed in large numbers and can equally enter aerosols when the tanks are cleaned or the discharge, and they can drift hundreds of yards, perhaps half a mile, with the Legionella bacteria in, and a passerby can be walking along in the street and can inhale the bacteria and develop Legionnaire's disease as a result. Equally get into showers and so on, but we're talking about long distance showers. With viruses it's different because they're so fragile. You see, that's the whole point. They're fragile, and they're pretty much immediately destroyed by ultraviolet light. So this is where the difficulty lies. And as we were saying yesterday, generally respiratory-borne pathogens don't tend. Of course, Legionnaire does cause pneumonia, but respiratory-borne viruses don't generally travel long distances, except for measles, which does. Maybe perhaps measles is especially robust type of virus, and chickenpox virus. So those are two that do seem to travel in aerosols or in the air, and can infect people at a distance. But I doubt if it was more than maybe 50 yards or 100 yards. I can't see them drifting these very, very delicate viruses for sort of miles into no, I should have said that in Q fever the aerosols can remain infectious in aerosols for 2 weeks, but that's because they have this their cysts, they kind of got this hard protective lining. But viruses just don't have that potential to survive in the hostile environment. They've got to go from me to you, within a matter of a few feet, to be effective in as vehicles for infection. So that's the general principle that really informs this debate, and I think it's a sound principle. And unfortunately, people tend to use the word aerosols rather loosely, and as airborne transmission, and so if you look at the standard textbooks which represent the ground truth, in different editions the word aerosol comes in and comes out, and there still doesn't seem to be consensus, as far as I can see, as to quite what the role is of aerosols in the strict sense, as regards SARS-CoV-2, whether they can cause infection at a distance in appreciable numbers. Yes. That seems to be a research question that hasn't been determined yet.
Yes. And the second part of the question I think you've answered, but I've got to put it to you. Is it possible that the aerosols could travel miles or into the next street wherever air is circulating? I mean, I think it follows from your answer.
Well, aerosols can, but if they contain SARS-CoV virus, infected virus, my impression is that they would degrade by the time they travelled out into the open air, any distance.
The last question was actually question 2, and it also relates to theme B.
Yes.
The question is, you discuss how COVID-19 may be amplified in closed spaces and is airborne. This means that it is inevitable we will all be exposed at some point. But could the introduction of UV light in air conditioning vents in hospitals and clinical settings help protect people when their health is already undermined? I mean, I'm bound to say in asking that question, is there an engineering or mechanical aspect to that question?
This sounds like an engineering type of question, but in principle, it's certainly worth considering, yes. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Croft. My Lord, that completes the questioning for Dr. Croft from the supplemental report and Rule 9 questions.
Now, you'll have appreciated, ladies and gentlemen, things have been a little bit fluid this morning. I just want to check with Mr. Gale. What's the situation? Do you know?
I think they might need to.
1:30. And that's okay, is it? Yeah. Yeah. I think you have been told that the ones at 1:30, which is a revision from what it was originally 1:45, so we'll come back at 1:30. Very good. Thank you all very much indeed.
All right.
Thank you, Doctor.